The letter came on a Tuesday, folded twice and sealed with wax gone soft in the heat of the traveling bag, and Caleb Ward read it twice before he believed what it said. He had sent for a nurse. The town needed one bad, and he had written the advertisement himself at the kitchen table with a stub of pencil, plain words for a plain need. What he got back was a name, a date of arrival, and nothing else. No mention of experience, no mention of family. Just a name, Rosalind Payne, and a promise to come on the noon train the second week of October. He told himself it did not matter what she looked like, whether she was old or young, soft-spoken or sharp-tongued. The fever had already taken 3 children that summer, and old Doc Anders had not left his cabin in a month, his hands too shook by drink or grief or both to be trusted with a needle anymore. The town needed someone who could stand in a sick room and not flinch, someone who could read a chart, mix a tincture, tell a mother the truth even when the truth was hard. Caleb needed that more than he needed a wife. Though the advertisement he'd placed in the paper back east had called it a marriage of convenience, because that was the only lawful way to bring a woman so far west and have the town accept her staying. He was 34 years old, and he had buried a mother, a father, and a brother in the plot behind the house he'd built with his own 2 hands. He knew what it was to watch someone he loved go still under a fever blanket, powerless, waiting for a morning that would not come easy. He had scars from that kind of waiting, ones that did not show on the skin, but sat behind the ribs like a stone that never warmed. He did not go looking for love. He went looking for someone competent, someone who would not scream at the sight of blood, someone who could keep her head when the whole town was losing theirs. The land around Miller's Bend was hard land, dry in summer and frozen solid come January, the kind of ground that broke plows and broke men who did not respect it. But it was his land, deeded and earned, and he had built a house on it that could withstand weather, and worse still, a house is not a home just because it has 4 walls and a roof that does not leak. It was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. It was quiet the way a held breath is quiet. On the day she arrived, the sky hung low and gray, threatening rain that never quite came, and he stood on the platform in his good coat, feeling foolish for wearing it, feeling more foolish for the way his hands would not stop finding new places to rest. He watched the train slow, watched the steam roll back along the cars like something exhaling after a long climb, and he watched the passengers step down one by one, until there was only one left. She was not what he expected, though later he would admit to himself that he had not truly expected anything, had refused himself the luxury of expectation, because expectation was just another word for hope, and hope was a thing he'd learned to ration carefully. She stepped down with a single case in her hand, no trunk, no trailing skirts fussed over for the occasion, just a plain traveling dress the color of wet slate and a coat too thin for the wind that had already started picking up. Her hair was pulled back simple, her face was calm, in a way that unsettled him faster than any tears could have. He said, "Miss Payne," she said. "Mr. Ward," and looked at him the way he imagined she looked at a wound before deciding how to dress it, not unkind, just assessing. He took her case. She let him, though her eyes followed the motion like she was cataloging something, filing it away for later use. They did not speak much on the ride out to the house, the wagon wheels, finding every rut in the road, the mules moving slow and steady beneath a sky that could not decide what kind of day it wanted to be. He told her the essentials, where the well was, where the school stood, though there was no school teacher left since the fever took the last one's patience, along with 2 of her students, where the church was, though the preacher had taken to speaking more about God's judgment than God's mercy, which had done nothing for morale. She listened. She did not ask about the marriage part of the arrangement, not that day, not on the ride, not even after they'd reached the house and he'd shown her the room that would be hers, plain and clean with a bed he'd made up himself the night before, unsure if his hands were fumbling from nerves or from something he did not have a name for yet. "There's fever in the hollow," he told her, because that was the truth, and there was no sense softening it. 3 dead since July. More sick than that, Doc Anders isn't fit to help anymore. "I heard," she said. "That's why I came." He wanted to ask her more. Where she'd trained. Who had taught her? Why a woman with steady hands and a calm face would answer an advertisement for a marriage she'd never met the other half of, travel 1,000 miles to a town she'd never seen for people she owed nothing. But something in the set of her jaw told him the question would not be welcomed. Not yet, maybe. Not for a long while. And he had learned patience, the hard way, the way the land teaches it, slow and without mercy. For those who rush. That night she asked for a list of the sick. He gave her what he had. Names and symptoms scratched in his own hand, imperfect but honest. She read it by lamplight at the kitchen table, her finger tracing down the page, her lips moving slightly like she was working through a puzzle only she could see the shape of. He watched her from the doorway, and did not know yet that he was watching the turning point of his life, quiet as it was, unremarkable as it looked. Just a woman reading a list by lamplight, and a man standing in a doorway. Neither of them speaking, both of them already changed. Rosalind Payne did not waste words, and Caleb came to understand this within the first week. The way a man comes to understand weather, by living inside it rather than being told about it. She rose before dawn without being asked, boiled water without being told why. And by the time he came in from the barn each morning, she had already inventoried what medicine existed in the house, which was little, and what needed replacing, which was almost everything. She asked for a wagon to town on her second day, and he drove her himself, watching from the seat of the wagon as she walked into the mercantile with a list longer than her arm and came out having argued the price down on half of it, her voice never rising, her manner never softening into pleading. The mercantile owner, a heavy-set man named Grissom, who fancied himself the unofficial mayor of Miller's Bend, watched her leave with an expression somewhere between offense and grudging respect. "That one's got a spine," he said to Caleb, loud enough to be heard. "She does," Caleb answered, and did not elaborate, though something in his chest had shifted at the sight of her walking back to the wagon with her chin level and her basket full, like she had already decided this town was hers to fix whether it wanted fixing or not. The hollow sat 2 miles east, a cluster of tenant houses where the poorer families lived, the ones who worked the Whitfield land on shares and never seemed to get ahead, no matter the harvest. It was there the fever had taken hardest root, and it was there Rosalind went first, without waiting for an invitation, without waiting for Caleb to accompany her, though he came anyway because he did not like the idea of her walking those roads alone with sickness thick in the air. The first house they entered smelled of sweat and tallow and something sourer beneath it, the smell he had come to associate with dying, though he never said that word aloud in front of the family gathered around the bed. A boy of maybe 7 lay beneath a quilt, gone gray from washing, his breath shallow, his lips cracked. His mother stood wringing a rag in her hands like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Rosalind knelt beside the bed without hesitation, laid the back of her hand against the boy's forehead, checked his pulse at the wrist, lifted his eyelid gently to look beneath it. And she did all this without speaking, and the mother watched her with the desperate hope of someone who has run out of other options. "How long has he had the cough?" Rosalind asked. 4 days? "And the fever since Sunday?" She nodded slowly, reached into her bag, and produced a small vial of something dark and bitter-smelling, measuring out drops with a precision that made Caleb think of a jeweler weighing gold. "This won't cure him outright," she said, and her honesty struck Caleb harder than any false comfort would have. "But it will bring the fever down enough that his body can fight what needs fighting, keep him warm, not hot. Small sips of water, often, not much at once. I'll come back tomorrow." The mother's hand shook as she took the vial, and she looked at Rosalind like she was looking at something she did not quite dare to call a miracle. Not yet. Not until she saw the proof of it. They visited 6 houses that day, and in each one Rosalind repeated some variation of the same careful ritual, the same honest assessment, the same refusal to promise more than she could deliver. Caleb watched her work and found himself thinking less about the fever and more about the woman fighting it, the way her hands never trembled even when the sickness in front of her was plainly, mortally serious, the way she spoke to frightened parents with a bluntness that somehow comforted rather than alarmed. That evening, riding back in the wagon, with the sun bleeding orange along the horizon, he finally asked the question he'd been holding since the platform. "Where'd you learn all this?" She was quiet a moment, watching the fields pass, and he thought perhaps she would not answer, that this was another door she meant to keep closed. Then she said, "I nursed my brother through consumption for 2 years before he died. After that, I nursed strangers because it seemed the only thing I was good for." "That's not nothing," he said, "being good for that." She looked at him, then a long look, like she was deciding whether he meant it as comfort or as something closer to understanding. "No," she said finally. "I suppose it isn't." They did not speak again until they reached the house. But something had shifted between them, subtle as a change in wind direction, the kind of thing you feel before you can name it. He unhitched the mules while she carried her bag inside, and later, over a supper of beans and cornbread, eaten mostly in silence, he found himself watching her hands, still and folded now, and thinking that competence, real competence, the kind that did not need praise or witness, was its own kind of beauty, quieter than most. But the days that followed fell into a rhythm. Neither of them named aloud, but both understood. She rose early, worked through her rounds in the hollow and in town, came home in the evenings with her bag lighter of medicine and her shoulders heavier with the weight of what she'd seen. He worked the land, mended fences, hauled water, did what a man does when the ground demands his attention, regardless of what fevers rage 2 miles east. But he began finding reasons to be near the house more often than the work strictly required, began noticing when her lamp burned late into the night, as she mixed remedies at the kitchen table, began leaving a cup of coffee at her elbow without being asked and without comment when he did. She noticed, too. He could tell by the way her eyes would flick to him sometimes across a room, assessing the same careful assessment she gave a patient. Though he liked to think there was something warmer in it when it was aimed at him. Neither of them spoke of courtship. The marriage between them existed on paper, signed before a circuit judge who'd passed through town the week after her arrival. A practical arrangement witnessed by Grissom and the judge's clerk. No flowers, no vows beyond the legal minimum required. But something had begun growing in the space between practical arrangement and something else. Something neither of them had words for yet, or perhaps both had words for, and simply chose not to spend them too soon. It was Grissom who first noticed the letters. He ran the Post as well as the Mercantile, and he mentioned it to Caleb one afternoon while weighing out nails. In the offhand way he mentioned most things, like he was testing the weight of the words before deciding if they mattered. "Your wife's been getting letters," Grissom said, "from back east. Same hand each time. She reads them quick and burns them in the stove same night." Caleb said nothing, though something cold moved through him, quiet and unwelcome, like a draft finding its way through a crack in a wall he'd thought was solid. He had noticed the letters, too, had noticed the way Rosalind's face went carefully blank when they arrived, the way she would excuse herself to read them alone, the way the kitchen would smell faintly of burnt paper on those evenings, though she always had the stove going anyway for cooking, so it was easy enough to pretend not to notice. He did not ask her about it. He told himself this was patience, the same patience the land had taught him, the willingness to wait for a thing to reveal itself in its own season rather than dig at ground before it was ready to give up what it held. But some nights, lying awake in his own room down the hall from hers, he wondered if patience was truly what it was, or if it was simply fear, dressed up in a nobler word, fear that whatever those letters carried might be the kind of truth that changes everything. And he was not yet ready to have everything changed. The fever in the hollow began, slowly, to recede. It was not sudden, not the kind of miracle a preacher could stand up and shout about on a Sunday, but a gradual loosening of its grip, a handful of children who did not die when death had seemed certain, a scattering of fevers that broke instead of climbing higher. Word did spread the way word does in a small town, mouth to mouth, porch to porch, until Rosalind Payne's name was spoken with something approaching reverence by people who had never met her before October. People who now stopped her on the road to press a jar of preserves into her hands or simply to say thank you, their voices thick with a gratitude too large for the words available to carry it. She accepted this, the way she accepted most things, with a quiet nod and little more, And Caleb noticed that praise seemed to make her uncomfortable in a way that fever cases and frightened parents never had. She could face sickness without flinching, but a woman's tearful thanks on the mercantile step sent something skittering behind her eyes that looked almost like guilt, and he began to wonder what a woman with nothing to be guilty of would have to feel guilty about. The answer came, as these things do, not through confession but through circumstance, the way the truth so often arrives sideways rather than head-on. It was Grissom again, though not through malice, simply through the loose-tongued habit of a man who knew everyone's business and rarely stopped to consider whose business was not his to share. "Fellow came through on the stage yesterday," he told Caleb, leaning against the counter with the particular relish of a man delivering news he found interesting, asking after a woman matching your wife's description. Said his name was Whitcomb. Said he'd come a long way to find her. The name meant nothing to Caleb, but the way Grissom said it, weighted and careful, told him it should mean something, that there was a story behind those 3 syllables that he was not yet privy to. "Did you tell him where she was?" "Told him there was a nurse come to town matching that description." "Yes." "Didn't seem right to lie about it, not with him looking so respectable and all, good coat, good manners." "Ask was she married?" "I told him yes, married to you." Grissom paused, weighing his next words the way he weighed his nails, careful and deliberate. He didn't look surprised by that. Looked more like it confirmed something he already suspected. Said he'd be back through in a few days' time. Said he had business to settle with her. Caleb rode home that evening with those words turning over in his mind like a stone in a boot, small but impossible to ignore, each step a fresh reminder of its presence. Business to settle. What business could a well-dressed stranger from back east have with a nurse who burned her letters and flinched from gratitude? He thought of the vials in her bag, precise and unlabeled, except by her own careful hand. He thought of the way she'd said she nursed strangers because it seemed the only thing she was good for, and wondered now if that sentence had carried a weight he'd failed to lift, at the time a confession disguised as simple fact. He did not confront her that night. He watched her across the supper table, watched her hands moving with their usual steady competence as she portioned out the beans, and he told himself again that patience was a virtue the land had taught him, though the stone in his chest felt less like patience now and more like dread wearing patience's clothing, waiting for its moment to show its true face. The stranger arrived on a Thursday, 3 days after Grissom's warning, and Caleb was in town when the stage pulled in, close enough to see the man step down in his fine coat, close enough to see Rosalind's face when she came out of the mercantile and saw him standing there. He would remember that look for the rest of his life, the way all the careful composure she wore like armor seemed to crack for just a moment, not into fear exactly, but into something adjacent to it, something that looked like a debt, finally come due. "Rosalind," the man said, and his voice carried easy authority, "the kind money buys along with good coats and good manners. You've led me quite a chase, mister." "Whitcomb," she said, and her voice had gone flat and careful. The same voice she used with frightened parents when the news was not good. "I didn't expect you to come this far, didn't you?" He smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "You took something that wasn't yours to take. I've come to collect it." Caleb stepped forward then, unable to stay silent any longer, some protective instinct rising in him faster than caution could restrain it. "This is my wife you're speaking to. State your business plainly, or don't state it at all." Whitcomb's eyes moved to him with a kind of amused assessment, the look of a man used to being obeyed rather than questioned. "Your wife," he repeated, tasting the word like it was unfamiliar to him, or perhaps distasteful. "Has she told you, then, what she did before she came west? Has she told you whose remedies she's been dispensing to your grateful little town?" Rosalind's face had gone pale, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "Say what you've come to say, Whitcomb. Don't make a show of it. My father developed a formula," he said, turning his attention back to her, though his words seemed aimed at Caleb as much as at Rosalind, seemed designed to land in front of witnesses. "A fever remedy, tested and proven, meant to be sold through proper channels, meant to bring my family the recognition and profit it was due. This woman worked in my father's laboratory. She copied his formula before she left." Everything she's been giving your sick children, everything this town has been thanking her for, it was stolen. Stolen from a dying man who trusted her to assist him, not to rob him. The words landed in the street like stones dropped in still water, ripples spreading outward through the small gathering crowd that had assembled the way. Crowds do around any promise of drama. Caleb felt something cold settle in his stomach, not quite belief, not quite disbelief, but the terrible uncertainty of a man realizing he did not know the whole of the woman he'd married, that there had been rooms in her locked all along, and he had chosen not to ask for the keys. "Is that true?" he asked her, and he hated how the question sounded, hated the doubt threaded through it. But he needed to hear her answer, regardless of how much the asking cost either of them. Rosalind looked at him, and for a moment he thought she would not answer at all, would simply turn and walk away the way she'd walked away from whatever life had existed before Miller's Bend. But she did not walk away. She stood her ground, the same way she stood her ground beside every sickbed she'd knelt at these past weeks, and she said, "Part of it is true, the rest of it is a lie, dressed up to look like truth, which is worse." The evening had turned cold by the time they reached the house, the kind of cold that comes before the season truly commits to it, threatening frost, though none had fallen yet. Whitcomb had not followed them, content for the moment to let his accusation sit and fester in the town's imagination, and Caleb suspected that was precisely his intention, to poison the well of trust before he made whatever further demand he'd traveled west to make. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd read the sick list her first night in this house, and Caleb waited, not with the patience of a man untroubled, but with the patience of a man who has decided the truth, however painful, is better than the not knowing that had been gnawing at him since Grissom mentioned those burned letters. "His father was Dr. Whitcomb," she said finally. "A respected physician, or so everyone believed. I trained under him for 2 years, assisted in his laboratory, learned more from him than I'd learned in all my years nursing before that. He was developing a fever remedy, yes, but it wasn't his formula. He'd taken it years before from a country physician who died poor and unknown, a man who'd spent his life treating the kind of families that couldn't pay him properly, families like the ones in your hollow. Whitcomb stole the formula from that man's papers after he died, refined it slightly, and intended to patent it, sell it at a price only the wealthy could afford, and let the poor go on dying the way they always had, while he grew richer off a cure he never earned." Caleb sat very still watching her, waiting for the rest, because he understood now that this was not a confession of theft, but something closer to its opposite. "I found his notes," she continued, "the original formula, and the letters proving where it had truly come from. When he grew too ill to work, when it became clear he would not live to see his patent granted, I made copies of everything, the formula and the proof of its origin both. Then I left. I knew his son would come after me eventually. Once his father died and the estate was settled, once someone realized the notes were missing. I didn't take it to enrich myself. I took it because a cure that only the wealthy can afford is not a cure at all. It's a luxury, dressed up as mercy. Then why burn the letters? Why not simply tell me?" Her hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly around her cup. "Because I did not know if you would believe me over a man with good manners and a fine coat, over a story that made me sound like a thief instead of what I actually was. I have learned that truth does not always win against appearances. Caleb, I have learned that a woman's word carries less weight than a wealthy man's accusation. However false that accusation might be, I was afraid, not of Whitcomb finding me, of you looking at me the way you looked at me on that street tonight." He thought of that look now, thought of the doubt he had not been able to keep from his voice, and something in his chest ached at the memory of it, a fresh wound layered over old scars. "I'm looking at you now," he said quietly. "Tell me what you need me to understand." "The formula works," she said. "You've seen it work. Every child in that hollow who's still breathing is proof of that. Proof that a country doctor's forgotten remedy is worth more than Whitcomb's patents and profits combined. But if he wins this fight, if he proves I stole it from his laboratory rather than from his father's crimes, the courts will side with him. Men like that always find judges who owe them favors. And Tadas, he'll take back every vial, every note, and this town will lose its cure the same way it lost its doctor. To men more concerned with profit and pride than with the people actually dying. Caleb sat with us for a long moment, the lamp between them throwing soft light across the table, across her tired face and steady hands. And he thought of every sick bed he'd knelt beside with her these past weeks, every mother's relief, every child's fever breaking instead of climbing. He thought of his own mother, gone now, taken by a fever that no one had known how to fight, and he understood suddenly and completely what side of this fight he stood on. Had stood on since the moment he watched her kneel beside that first boy in the hollow with hands that did not shake. "Then we fight him," he said, "not with silence, not with running. We fight him with the truth, out in the open, where the whole town can see it plain." She looked at him, and something in her face shifted, some guard finally lowering after weeks of careful vigilance. "You believe me," she said. "Not quite a question." "I believe what I've seen," he said. "I've seen you save children. This town had already begun grieving. I've seen you work until your hands shake with exhaustion and never once complain of the cost to yourself. A thief doesn't work like that, Rosalind. A thief takes and runs. You stayed. You gave everything. You took away to people who needed it more than any wealthy man's ledger ever could." Something wet gathered in her eyes. Then, though she did not let it fall, holding herself together with the same discipline she brought to every sickroom she'd entered. "No one has said that to me before," she admitted. "Not in all the months since I left his laboratory. I've been waiting for someone to call me a thief and mean it, waiting for the accusation to finally land the way it seemed destined to." "It landed on the wrong man's doorstep then," Caleb said. "Because I don't see a thief across this table. I see the only reason half the children in that hollow are still drawing breath." Whitcomb called a meeting at the church 3 days later, having secured the preacher's cooperation through means Caleb suspected involved a donation to the collection plate, and the whole town gathered in pews that had seen more funerals than weddings that autumn, waiting to hear the case laid out against the woman who had, until 3 days ago, been treated as something close to a saint among them. Whitcomb stood at the front with the polish of a man accustomed to courtrooms and boardrooms, his voice carrying easily to the back pews, his story smooth and rehearsed, painting Rosalind as an opportunist who had preyed on a dying man's trust to steal his family's legacy. He spoke of lawsuits, of formulas patented and rightfully owned, of a woman who had disguised theft as charity to win a town's sympathy before the truth could catch up to her. Caleb watched the faces around him shift as Whitcomb spoke, watched doubt creep into expressions that had held nothing but gratitude just days before, and he understood now what Rosalind had meant about appearances outweighing truth, about a wealthy man's polished accusation carrying more natural weight than a woman's quiet honesty. When Whitcomb finished, he turned to Rosalind, who stood near the front with her hands folded and her chin level, betraying nothing of what this moment must have cost her. "Do you deny taking my father's formula?" "I don't deny taking the papers," she said, her voice carrying clear through the church despite its quiet register. "I deny that they were rightfully his to lose." She produced then what she had been keeping hidden these past weeks. Not letters from Whitcomb that she'd burned in careful performance of destroying evidence, but copies she had made of the true originals. Correspondence between Whitcomb's father and the country physician he had stolen from years before, dated and signed. Proof preserved, precisely because she had known this day would come, had known that truth alone would not be enough without evidence to stand behind it. She read the letters aloud, her voice steady even as gasps rippled through the congregation, the country physician's own words describing a formula developed over decades of treating families too poor to pay improperly, describing a visit from a young doctor. Whitcomb, eager to learn, describing papers that went missing shortly before the physician's own death from causes never fully explained. "My father did not steal," Whitcomb said. But his voice had lost some of its earlier polish, had begun to sound like a man reciting lines he no longer fully believed himself. "Your father built a fortune on a dying man's mercy," Rosalind said. And you came west to finish what he started, to take a cure away from children who need it and sell it back to their parents at a price that would bury half this town in debt, while the other half simply died waiting to afford it. I am not the thief in this church, Mr. Whitcomb. I am the only one here who refused to let theft become a family trade. The silence that followed held the particular weight of a town realizing it had almost condemned the wrong person, realizing how close appearances had come to outweighing truth. And Caleb watched Whitcomb's composure crack fully now, watched him understand that he had lost not just this argument, but the audience's sympathy along with it. To an audience of people whose children owed their lives to the woman he'd tried to paint as a criminal. He left on the evening stage, having secured no promises, no formulas returned, no legal victory to carry back east with him, only the quiet, absolute humiliation of a man who had believed money and manners would be enough to overturn simple truth and had learned otherwise in front of an entire congregation. Winter came hard that year, the way it always did in that country. But the Hollow survived it better than any winter in recent memory. The formula Rosalind had carried west, continuing its slow, steady work through the cold months when fevers traditionally ran highest. Doc Anders, shamed perhaps by comparison or simply reminded of what his calling had once meant to him, began appearing at her side on the harder cases, sober and useful again, for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, learning from her with the humility of a man who understood he had let his town down and meant to do better by it. Caleb watched his wife move through those winter months, with a settledness that had not been there before. A woman no longer waiting for the accusation to land, no longer burning letters in careful performance for an audience of no one but herself. She had told him everything by then, the full accounting of her time in Whitcomb's laboratory, the physician's death that had never been properly investigated, her own quiet certainty that grief and guilt over a stranger's stolen legacy had driven her west with nothing but a bag of vials and a resolve to make something right that could never be fully undone. He had not judged her for any of it. He had only asked once why she had chosen his advertisement specifically among whatever others might have existed, and she had told him the plainest truth she had left to give. Because it didn't promise romance, she said, it promised need. I had nothing left in me for romance when I left Whitcomb's house, Caleb. I had only enough left to be useful, and your advertisement was the only one that seemed to want that above anything else. He thought about that answer through the long winter evenings, thought about how a marriage built on practical need had become something neither of them had expected nor sought, but it found anyway, the way spring finds ground that winter thought it had claimed for good. He had married her for competence, for capable hands in a sick room, for someone who would not flinch. What he had gotten instead was a woman who had taught him that love, real love, was rarely loud or sudden, but built slowly through shared work and earned trust, through watching someone kneel beside a dying child night after night and never once complain of the cost. Spring came the way it always did in that country, reluctant, and then all at once the ground thawing, the fields waking, the Hollow's children running through mud puddles that just months before had seemed destined to become their graves. Rosalind's reputation had settled into something permanent now, not the fevered gratitude of that first autumn, but a quieter, steadier respect, the kind a town gives to something it has come to depend on, the way it depends on rain or harvest. Caleb found her one evening in early spring standing at the edge of the property where his mother's grave sat beneath a young oak tree, the same spot she had visited quietly several times that winter without ever telling him why. He came to stand beside her, and for a while neither of them spoke, the way they had learned to let silence carry what words sometimes could not. I couldn't save her, Rosalind said finally, though he had never told her exactly how his mother died. Had never needed to, because grief recognizes grief the way water finds its own level. I know I couldn't have. It was before I knew what I know now, but I think about her sometimes. Wonder if the remedy would have helped if I could have been here sooner. You're here now, he said. That's the part that matters. Not the version of things that might have been, but the one that is. She turned to look at him then, and something in her face had settled fully into peace, the last of that old vigilance finally at rest. "I used to think I was only good for nursing strangers," she said, "for being useful to people who would forget me the moment they were well again. I didn't expect to find a place where I was needed, as more than that." "You're needed as more than that," he said. "You have been since the day you stepped off that train." She smiled. Then, small and real, the kind of smile that had grown more frequent through the winter months, though it still surprised him each time it appeared, still felt like something earned rather than given freely. "The advertisement," she said. "Do you still have it?" He did. He kept it folded in a drawer in the room that had once been only his, a room that now held both their lives tangled together in ways neither of them had anticipated when he'd first written those plain, practical words at the kitchen table. He went and found it, brought it back to where she stood beneath the oak tree, and she read it again in the fading spring light. The same words she'd read 1,000 miles east, the words that had promised nothing but need and had somehow delivered everything else besides. "Nurse wanted," she read aloud. "Steady hands required. No time for courtship, only for competent work." She laughed softly, the sound carrying out over the fields that had once been fallow with fear and were now green again with something closer to hope. "You didn't promise me anything, Caleb Ward." "No," he agreed. "I didn't." "And yet," she said, folding the paper carefully, the way she folded everything with precision and care, "here we are." "Here we are," he echoed and took her hand, and together they watched the light shift gold across the fields where the Hollow's children played in mud that no longer threatened to become their graves, where a formula stolen from a dying man's mercy had found its true home at last among people who needed it more than any ledger ever could, and where a marriage built on plain practical need had grown, slowly and without fanfare, into something that finally deserved a truer name.